Hello, Intactivists. Today I have a special guest with me, Allie from Genital Autonomy Zone. So, Allie, how are you today?
Doing pretty well. Pretty relaxing weekend for the most part.
Heck yeah, that is awesome. So, Allie, for those who don't know who are you? What do you do? What's your
So
background?
I am Allie. I use she, her pronouns. I also go by Tatlin in some online spaces. Could call me an intactivist. I generally prefer the term genital autonomy activist. And I run a support and educational Discord called the Genital Autonomous Zone, which is specifically for the intersection of trans, intersex, and gender diverse peoples and violated genital autonomy.
Can you explain that in a more
Mm,
like I'm a second grader? Just
That's
because
fair.
like the whole
So
trans movement is hard to like figure out for some
yeah,
people. Like, is this
trans is
for
an umbrella, but like intersex is referring to people who were not necessarily born, but potentially that have not
or
typical sex characteristics in terms of, for an example, I started developing breast in puberty despite being assigned male at birth. And gender diverse is kind of a catch-all, includes a lot of like non-binary identities,
okay, so like
gender in particular.
hermaphrodites?
That's actually a term that is sometimes considered a slur, but
My apologies.
some people may reclaim it. It's no worries. People are honestly very uneducated about the intersex experience, and it's something that I've noticed is like kind of skipped a lot of generations and is just now being talked about with Gen Z, which is younger than me. So I feel like there's not been a lot of talk about it among millennials, and that is something that I am also trying to recreate or create in my support group.
Okay. There's intersex people in your
Intersex,
group, and then there's
yeah,
also
trans
intactivists.
people and
Tr- Okay.
gender diverse peoples, and who are also for genital autonomy, for intactivism, for whatever reason, and seeking support for likely their own experiences as well, which is an intersection that has generally not been like targeted by other groups and has people may not feel very included. Like, and I've been to quite a few other intactivist groups on like Discord and Reddit, and I think like the foreskin restoration subreddit is actually pretty great about it. But when you come to like the individual support groups, like if there's one trans person, people may not know anything about transness, and it can be exhausting constantly explaining yourself. And the goal is to create a space where people don't have to constantly explain themselves in a way that they can engage with this topic in a way that's less exhausting, and they can process their own stuff and educate themselves and perhaps do some activism themselves as well.
Okay. So is the mission of Genital Autonomy Zone, are you guys for leaving people under 18 alone, or are you for the puberty blockers and stuff like that?
I
Like,
mean, puberty blockers are generally okay. It's it's a delay, really. But like the main thing is definitely don't want people to perform surgeries on anyone regardless of their gender or like if they're intersex, generally against corrective, quote unquote, corrective surgeries that on intersex people sometimes happen. And I think it's also a good thing to clear up that that basically never happens for trans people. Trans people basically do not have access to surgeries under 18. It's practically impossible. Anything you hear about is like a fringe, extremely rare case. And I want to make that very clear.
okay.
So I think a better way of putting it is we're absolutely for consent and for like children's rights in terms of the right to their own personal sovereignty and not being just an extension of their parents' rights, which is
Okay.
another loaded term in like current society.
All right, that's interesting. Okay, so do you believe that once the child is able to verbalize what he wants or she wants, they should be able to go and do surgeries on their reproductive organs?
Not necessarily, no. That's again, it doesn't really happen, and it's I can understand in like some cases, but it just generally doesn't happen. It's not exactly what like Gaz is working on. That's like not really the like experience that happens to people that people need to seek support through because it doesn't happen.
Okay. So
It's not
what
what Gaz is for.
okay, so what does all gas do?
So it's a support group for people who have had violated genital autonomy, and that includes stuff like circumcision and quote unquote intersex corrective surgeries. So I pull up the description for a bit more of a list. So it includes stuff like support for foreskin restoration, and also like phimosis stretching is very adjacent because if someone has phimosis, society right now will probably convince them to get circumcised, which is totally unnecessary and is not really informed consent in current society because as a child they'll be very, very much influenced and told this is the only way. Also, I suppose for people when they are an adult, for like consensual like genital modifications that can include a lot of things like piercings or surgery if that's something they want.
Okay, so is gas intactivism but widening the umbrella to intersect people essentially?
So in essence, it's to make people on the left feel comfortable being in these spaces and not being exhausted,
When you say
and so they
left,
can seek support
when you say left, do you mean like
politically.
politically left? Okay.
Yeah,
Interesting.
because in the current like cultural conscious, there is a conflation with anti-circumcision movements and movements for genital autonomy and with anti-Semitism, which does not need to be there, but there is like a conflation that people don't really understand. And the left is understandably saying pretty much that they don't want to be a part of anti-Semitism whatsoever. So they might just not engage with it. And I want to like reduce that stigma that genital autonomy activism is like attached to that because it's not. It's just a stigma.
Oh,
And by creating a space where anti-Semitic talking points aren't allowed, it can essentially make people on the left feel comfortable being intactivist and seeking out support for their own issues or education.
okay. Just to clarify, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I
Mm,
feel like some people might read into this like this. Because you said like, the left democratic. Do you feel like the not to get too political either, but do you feel like the
mm.
the right or Republicans, do you feel like they're okay with being anti-Semitic and hating of
I
other
don't
people's religions?
I don't know if they're necessarily okay with it, but I feel like they're willing to tolerate it in a way that makes people on the left uncomfortable with being in those spaces. If like those talking points are brought up, they're just going to feel very uncomfortable and not want to be there, pretty much.
Okay. Interesting. So,
Actually,
do you have to
sorry,
be a Democrat to join your group though, or could you be
no.
a Republican
I
to
mean,
join your group?
I honestly don't think that anyone is a Republican and identifies with that would be comfortable in the group. It's I mean, it's not necessarily attached to any political parties, but with like being in support of like intersectional ideals and identities, it's like a requirement for the group. And I honestly don't think there are many Republicans that are there.
Okay.
And yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I don't um
that's fair.
yeah, I don't know what Gaz goes through. I also don't know what
Yeah. But
Republicans think.
on that point, Gaz actually wasn't initially exclusive to trans, intersex, and gender diverse peoples. It was kind of created in response to anti-Semitic talking points and the likes being allowed in other spaces. And some of our first members were actually Jewish men who didn't feel comfortable talking about their own like grief and like struggles with like restoring and circumcision in general.
So
It
do
wasn't
you
exactly the space I envisioned because it attracted a lot of gay men who I think were able to find like support in other spaces and kind of would speak over trans, intersex, and gender diverse peoples with more intersectional identities.
Okay. So does Gaz work with other intactivist groups and like branch out?
There's quite a few server partnerships with intactivist discords and like foreskin restoration discords and very related things. That's mostly on Discord, and we are trying to reach out to other organizations to form partnerships and reach out to people that need support in those organizations and that are accessing those organizations, like their websites and such.
Okay. So you guys aren't a protesting group though per se. It's more like a
It's
counseling group.
Yeah, it's more of a support group and also an educational group. And activism, it it is a thing that people like talk about there. It's support for activism, so in a way to prevent like activist burnout, like if they can seek support in a way that's less exhausting on the subject, they'll be less likely to burn out as an activist and may be able to continue their own work. It's not something that we explicitly do ourselves. However, I personally am quite involved in activism and would like to do more of that.
Okay. So can you explain like your past with intactivism then and what you have done for them?
Yeah, so originally I was like, for lack of a better term, I was woke to the issue by a lecture that people are probably pretty familiar with on here, Elephant in the Hospital, that was done by Ryan McAllister. And that woke me to the issue, and I was honestly very depressed for a while after that. And it was very hard to work through. And I didn't really get into doing much intactivism myself until a couple years ago when I started restoring again. And it's very hard to not think about the issue when you're restoring. The way I started with that is actually with a lot of the resources Your Whole Baby provides in terms of printable stickers and pamphlets and like posters. I was working in a hospital and I spent a lot of the time working by spreading those pamphlets in waiting rooms and in bathrooms, like on changing stations for like how to change an intact baby, pretty much like instructions to not force retract their foreskin because it's adhered to the glands. And my thought is that people will see these and question, people leave their babies intact if they didn't, and if they did, hopefully it will prevent forced retractions. Also, I spread some intersex activism stuff too for genital autonomy, and that's mostly with an organization called Interact, and they have some pamphlets on their website that you can also print. And funnily, so my ex had found I don't remember what it was called, but what are those groups? There's a discount card that was not his that he would use at Office Depot or Office Max. I think they're the same thing now. And I would use their printers to print out these things. And specifically, I would use shipping label paper because it's like a sheet of sticker paper. So could actually show you those. I have some on hand.
Okay, awesome.
I use the Elephant at the Hospital ones a lot right now, but I actually ran out of them. I don't think these are going to show up well enough for anyone to read, but this is a
Uh,
thing for intact care.
is that
This one's like,
Spanish?
yeah, I have both Spanish and English ones. And on the back of it, let's see, you can see that it's a Office Depot thing, and you can peel this off, and it's a sticker. And it's very easy to print a large amount of them that way. And that's what I would recommend anyone that's like getting into intactivism to do. It's very, very easy, very low risk, especially if they're doing it in a bathroom. No one's going to come into the bathroom and ask them what they're doing, right?
Yeah, that's true. Please check your local laws though before you do this, guys. I just don't want anyone to get in trouble for doing this and then being like,
Yeah,
"Oh,
that is fair.
I heard it on the POTS program." So you worked
And
in the hospital though?
yeah, it wasn't like a a medical job. I was just security.
Oh, okay. I thought you had like a medical background. All right.
No, but it did give me a position where I had access to a lot of people that might be wanting to think about that and would be in a position where that information might actually be relevant. I'd also
Oh,
like to do some like boots on the ground activism. There's the World Naked Bike Ride, and I wanted to go to that and write something very attention grabbing, like foreskin restoration works, and point to my genitals, which is very pointed and would be a very vulnerable position. But I think it would attract a lot of attention, and people might come ask about it, right?
yeah, definitely. So when you do these protests, are you with a group or are you with like just by yourself?
That would be with a group because the World Naked Bike Ride is like a protest in general, and there's a lot of people that bike essentially naked.
Okay. And is that for genital autonomy or
That's more of a general, I think maybe for naturism. I'm not super familiar with it. It's more of a general protest.
okay.
And other than that, I've tried to convince people that I knew were like expecting parents. That I feel like is a story that every intactivist has, is trying that, failing or succeeding, and it's very very heavy doing it that way. Like when you there's a more very direct result of it, and you might actually know, and that can be very discouraging and very difficult. There's actually a couple that I talked to that was like offended that I would even ask them and that they if they would cut their child because they wouldn't, and it was very awkward after that because I knew these people.
Well, at least they wouldn't though, so that's
Yeah,
good.
exactly. It was a better result from that.
So do you have an intactivist that you look up to or is influential in your life? Like a favorite intactivist?
In terms of like motivation for starting the like specific sort of intactivism that I'm doing now, I think Ryan McAllister had a lot to play in it. He's an intactivist that I look up to quite a bit in terms of their the reason that I'm aware of it with Elephant in the Hospital, but also they did an article called Elephant in the Genital Autonomy Movement talking about anti-Semitism on beyondthebreast.com. I don't know if they're like specifically like associated with that, but that's where I saw the article.
Okay. So is Genital Autonomy Zone, is it a nonprofit or
It's not currently anything like super official. It's a peer support group. So it's just run on Discord, and it doesn't currently have any like particular status like that. And
okay.
I'm not sure that I want to try to do that because it can make things much slower and in a way less effective because there's a lot more accountability to like oh, the like status quo in a way running a charity like that.
Okay. So but you do lead Genital Autonomy Zone, like you are the leader of it.
I hosted and created it, yeah.
Okay, that's super awesome.
Actually looking to make a more inclusive, similar space that I'm going to call Genital Autonomy Collective. It'll also be a peer support group and educational server.
Wow. I also don't want to cut you off. I feel like you have like
Hmm.
stuff already like written, so I don't want to like butt in and ask
I don't know.
questions.
I have bullet points.
Oh, you have bullet points? Okay, okay.
Nothing specific, just sort of vague things that I would want to mention.
Okay, so circumcision grief, have you heard about them before?
Yeah, actually, Discord is partnered with them.
Okay, so does Genital Autonomy Zone, do they have like their own Reddit and Discord and other social medias like that, or is it just on
Not
Discord?
currently, it's just on Discord. It is something that I've been wanting to branch out with because Discord looks like it might be going in not the greatest direction in terms of I don't know if you're familiar with community servers at all in terms of like their privacy concerns. Discord is like trying to force pretty much everyone into creating a community server. And with that, I kind of want to branch it out to more platforms so that if Discord ever becomes too problematic to use because of that, there would be other options. I am a little bit worried that like splitting the focus of the group, it wouldn't be as active to provide the same amount of support, but that's for the future to worry about, I suppose.
Okay, so but it is only in as of right now on Discord.
Mm-hmm. I created a Facebook group as well, but I haven't like done anything with it. Just as an alternative.
Okay.
It's not currently active.
All right. So I know the intactivists sometimes can be a rowdy bunch. How many people do you think that you actually have to get rid of from your server?
Do you mean in terms of like if someone is not withholding like the intersectional ideals, if I have to ban them or anything like
Yes,
that?
yes, and they just break rules and they
It's
say whatever.
generally relatively low. There's a vetting process that people just have to answer a few questions before they can enter the server. And for the most part, that weeds out people that would be otherwise bad actors. And I've only had to ban maybe a couple people over the last, I guess it's over a year now.
Okay. So what are the common myths that you have to deal with in your group?
Oh, wow. That's, I'm not super sure. That's quite a broad question. I did think of a pretty big one, and that's like the difference between dysphoria and dysmorphia. One thing that people may not think about that I get from my unique intersectional experience is that the experience of being a victim of child genital cutting and also being trans and the dysphoria that you can feel from either of those is actually a very similar feeling, to the point that when I was younger, they were very much like intertwined and very confusing, that I didn't know which was which feeling, because they're both dysphoria. And that's something that people get confused with dysmorphia a lot, which is different. So dysphoria is a sort of general malaise of like very negative feelings about like the truth and like what is actually there. And for example, lacking a foreskin can cause dysphoria because there should be a foreskin there, and very negative feelings, right? It's extremely similar to the feelings that you might get with gender dysphoria from a lot of people's perspectives that I've heard. And on that note, I do want to mention that I'm speaking from my own experience as an intersex trans person, and not for like every trans and intersex person.
Okay.
And dysmorphia, on the other hand, is feeling very negative feelings and not necessarily seeing the truth. The common example of this is someone with anorexia. They might see themselves as very overweight, but in reality, they're not. They're very thin. And the problem with this is that in the past, a lot of doctors have, if anyone had like come up with dysphoria around their child genital cutting, the doctors might diagnose them with dysmorphia, body dysmorphic disorder instead, which is extremely like crazy making and gaslighting. It's essentially telling them your perspective is wrong, and it's just not true. Usually these people, they can see the truth. They can tell they don't have a foreskin, and that's a problem, right?
Yeah. So do you think that circumcision has led more people to be transsexual because they are missing an essential part of their body?
I don't think so. I think it's possible that it has made people like have more trouble realizing they are trans, and or realizing they're not, I suppose, in terms of those feelings being very similar. Like it can make a trans person feel more dysphoric because a circumcision is, in at least in the West and the US, it's a very gendered surgery. Like it's essentially surgically assigning someone male in a way. And having like gone through that non-consensually, it can conflate with gender dysphoria and child genital cutting dysphoria. Also, I do want to mention that the term transsexual is generally considered outdated, and people use the term transgender.
I'm
It's
sorry. I
no
suck
big
at
deal.
this, guys. Yeah, I oh man, my yeah, I'm not very up to date on this, which I probably should have been. Is there like a list of like definitions on your Discord or like a website? Do you guys have a
Um,
website that you guys have?
we don't, but we were planning on making one.
Okay.
There are some other sources that I can find and have you link in the description if that's something you'd like.
Oh yeah, I
Um,
will definitely link a lot of stuff in the description.
I
Um,
suppose there's like the gender dysphoria Bible, and then there is, I think Interact has an article on like terminology for intersex people as well. That is something that is like pinned in the server. I didn't mention what Interact is. It's just an intersex activism charity organization.
oh, I've never heard of that. So what
Yeah,
do they
they're
do?
a lot of education about intersex people. Like the pamphlets that I mentioned spreading earlier in the hospital were from them, talking to essentially like expecting parents about intersex normally, quote unquote, normalizing surgeries and how those are generally harmful and that sort of a thing. It's
Okay.
essentially
Hmm.
like genital autonomy, but on for intersex people, because genital autonomy is like generally the only issue people tend to know about intersex people. And even with that, people don't tend to know that.
So what percentage are intersect people?
It's actually much higher than people would expect. Like quotes that like people often give are like 2.5%, but I honestly expect it's like 10% because people don't know, and certain conditions that people try to not consider intersex off like realistically are like sometimes hypospadias, which is essentially when for an AMAB person the urethra is lower down on the penis somewhere, and that's a more like typically female position that sometimes isn't considered intersex. And also PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, it increases like testosterone levels in a way that can be an intersex condition. And I think it's important knowing that the term intersex is more about a demographic and experiences rather than a diagnosis. Diagnoses are just quite a few examples. There's a ton of variations of what can make someone intersex. But people that identify with intersex, it's usually more about like social experiences in terms of, I think I mentioned earlier, not being able to go into locker rooms because I had breast as a as a teen, and despite being assigned male at birth, and that sort of experience, being bullied for that is what is considered a common intersex experience. Or another big one is not knowing if you've had like a surgery because it's often hidden from children.
Hey, if you want to see more of Allie, let me know by giving this video a like, and you can join this conversation down in the comments below. Also, I'll link Gaz's Discord down in the description. Also, please subscribe to get more Intactivist news and interviews. Thank you for watching. Bye.